Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome back. We are moving right along with the quarter and continuing where we picked up last class, where we were talking about group membership. So this week is really interested in understanding what it means to be part of a group, the different types of roles that we play, the ways that norms and certain patterns of communication happen in groups. As part of class today, I'll be going over your first writing assignment for the class. I like to use shorter assignments that aren't requiring a whole lot of points or don't count a lot toward your grade, but are a chance to get your feet wet, think about grading, get some feedback from me that can help you in improving and working on some skills for writing as you get into later assignments. So last class, we went over and again refreshed on some major things from the course, including for folks that were here for the first time on Monday. So this is now our third class meeting, 2 weeks in. So we're continuing to work through some key ideas. We also spent some time talking about group norms. You might recall that there's different categories and types of norms, and you were asked to sort some of the things that emerge in your own group into different norms and categories too. Remember from last class, we talked about how the group norms that we have can be both implicit and explicit, right? Implicit means that it's implied, it's not written out. So if you're a member of a team, right, and your team always goes out for pizza whenever you have a big game, right, that'd be an implicit norm. Whereas an explicit norm, right, would be filling out something like a student handbook or some type of agreement related to your club or organization. So we went through and talked about those a little bit to understand what it means to participate in a group. And then we also talked about how these different categories of norms can be understood and relate to our identities, right? The idea of interaction is the communication we have within a group. Procedure refers to how a group is put together, right? Do you raise your hand to ask questions or is it more conversational? Status relates to the power and authority that members of a group might have and how they can wield that authority. And then lastly, achievement. What is the group trying to do or accomplish? If you're working on a group project for a class, right, the end goal would be the project or presentation that you give. So for this class, I want to start out by discussing the group membership reflection assignment. Again, that's your first written assignment for the class, and I'll be going over what I'm looking for there. We'll also be talking about elements of group membership roles. So there'll be a lot of different categories of these kinds of roles. And we'll be talking about the impact that things like status and trust can have on your groups as well. Which are all useful things as you think about and prepare for this written assignment. As a reminder, your week 1 quiz is due by the end of the day today. Remember that you are completing that quiz through Canvas. It's open note and open book. You have unlimited time to take it. I recommend having tabs open or having access to week 1 reading as well as the syllabus as you're working through that. Again, that's due by the end of the day today since I gave you an extension on that assignment. So that's coming up. So let's talk a bit about the group membership reflection. Again, that's your first major written assignment. And because we started delayed due to the weather, I'm giving you a little bit more time to complete that assignment. So if you check on our course page on Canvas, again, you'll notice that the video, the slides for each day are available there. If you go to week number 3, you'll see that the group membership reflection is due. So it was originally going to be due a week from Sunday on the 23rd. But again, because of winter closures, I wanted to give you some extra time. So it'll be due 2 weeks from today on January 26th. So I want to take some time to go over this assignment, what you should expect and what you can do in order to do well in this assignment. Remember that in these first few days of class and early on in readings, we've been talking about what small group communication is, what it means to be a member of a group, and what things like roles and participation in a group looks like. So this short writing assignment is asking you to look at and analyze a small group that you are or have been a part of. So you've done a lot of this already through some of your brainstorming, including your activity for Monday's class. You can pick, again, the small group that makes the most sense to you, that you have details that you can share about. But I recommend a couple things. First of all, while you can use something like a friend group, I recommend if there's another like extracurricular or professional group that is more goals oriented or focused, to focus on that one if you can. The other thing I recommend is a group that ideally has somewhere between 3 and 8 people. You can go a bit more than 8 if you want to, such as an athletic team that has more people in it. But don't go below 3 because otherwise it's just interpersonal communication rather than group communication. So be thinking about a group that makes sense to you, maybe a group that you've been brainstorming or thinking about already for this class. Your essay should be 2 pages, double spaced, times New Roman, standard font and margins. Again, it's a very short assignment. It's only 2 pages, so I'm not asking you to write a whole major essay. It's just going to be a fairly short reflection. You can either write it continuously, right? Just use transition and introduction paragraphs in a way that goes between these 3 points. Or you can, using the paragraph structure, divide it up by question. Have the number 1 and then have some paragraphs to describe it. But they should be full and complete paragraphs. So don't use things like bullet points if you're working through these numerically. You need to include in-text citations, right? So one common misconception is that you don't need to include in-text cites if you're paraphrasing. You should always include in-text citations. If you are quoting or paraphrasing, and the good rule of thumb here is that if the material that you're citing is outside of common knowledge or your own personal experience, then you should cite. For instance, if you're talking about, for instance, interaction and goal-oriented roles, that's not an original idea, right? That comes from the text. So you'd want to cite it even though you're not directly quoting verbatim. You should include APA, preferably, which would be something like the last name and the year. But if you feel strongly about using MLA or Chicago, you can. I'll be taking some time, including on Friday, to talk a little bit more and refresh you on citation styles, since you've probably done some citing already for other classes. I really recommend using the Purdue OWL, which is a great resource for citation style and formatting. So there should also be a separate works cited page when citing from that does not count toward the 2 pages. So the first thing that I'm asking you to do is picking that small group that you've chosen. Again, it could be an extracurricular activity. You're either currently a member or you have been a member in the past. I want you to think about how that group communicates, right? So a short or bad answer is our group uses Snapchat. A better and more developed and A answer, right, would be our group primarily uses Snapchat. As a result of that, we tend to have quick communication. We're regularly checking in with each other, but at the same time, because our photos get deleted, it's hard for us to keep much of a paper trail or maintain communication that's very traceable, which has caused problems in the past because of XYZ, right? So using details and examples from your small group that you've chosen is the best way to do well in this assignment. Next thing, right, is not just considering those channels, but some of the norms, the ways that your communication in this group might or might not be effective, and so on. The next thing that I'm asking you to look at is to think about your own role and membership within this group. In just a minute, we'll be talking about Belbin's self-perception inventory, some of the different roles that fit under there. But I want you to really take some time to reflect on what you see yourself as doing within that group. What role do you occupy? What do you add to the group? What are ways that maybe you feel included or excluded and on the margins in your group? So again, examples can really help here. For instance, maybe you're an implementer, right? and you're part of a radio show and you're the person that really helps put the script together and organize and create the show for the day. That's a good example of using some of these ideas in class. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, I want you to take some time to think about the strengths and weaknesses of your small group. For instance, what are some of the ways that your group communicates really well? What are some things that don't go so well? For instance, do you have social loafers, people that are off task or not focusing? Do you have trouble staying on task when you have meetings? Have you had serious situations of miscommunication or disagreement amongst your group members? So be thinking about some of the ways that effective small group communication is created and the ways that your group might or might not exhibit those. So again, to address these 3 prompts. On the next page, I have a rubric. As a reminder for this class, I'm happy to look at rough drafts, outlines, or answer questions. Just send those to me early enough so that I can turn that back around to you in time and give you some good feedback. In fact, a lot of folks that do really well in classes with me are folks who do send those rough drafts or outlines in advance and seek feedback. So I definitely recommend doing that. As a reminder, right, citing sources is a really good idea because I would much rather have a late paper, plagiarized paper, right? At best, plagiarized paper that doesn't cite sources is a 0 on the assignment. At worst, it's a 0 in the class. So it's a lot more strategic for you to take the time to do that, even if it's late. On the next page, I grade assignments based on 3 factors: substance, style, and structure. Substance is the content of your essay. Style is the way that your essay is written with conventions, grammar, citation. And structure is the way that your essay follows and flows. Is it clear? Does it have good topic sentences, transition sentences, and so on? So some of the things I'm looking for, right, on substance, do you explain what this small group is? Do you explain how this small group communicates? Do you talk about the role and membership you have within that group and categorize it using that self-perception inventory? Do you evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses, the way that that small group communicates? And do you include some good examples? That's kind of fun. From the small group. And again, using ideas from the course and reflecting on the ways that the course material relates to your group that you've chosen. That's what I'm looking for on substance, multiple paper. Should be at least 2 pages. So you can go over 2 pages if you want to, but it should have that as baseline. If you've taken a class before with me, you know that I'm a really big fan of the use of previews and reviews and clear signposting of main points. One method that I really like is tell me what you're going to tell me, tell me what you told me. So tell me what you're going to tell me. In an introduction, right, or early on in the essay, you establish the main points that you're going to be covering. First, I'll talk about my own participation in the small group. Then I'll talk about its norms. And lastly, I'll address its strengths and weaknesses. Then tell me, right, in the content of the paper, you go over these ideas and use good supporting details. Tell me what you told me. At the end of the paper, you summarize and remind us what you went over. So make sure that you have good use of topic sentences that guide the rest of the paragraph. A good rule of thumb is that if a paragraph is going longer than about half a page double spaced, it's probably a good idea to do a paragraph break and move on to the next paragraph. By then, you're oftentimes drifting toward another topic. And then lastly, style. So my partner runs a nonprofit, and she has to write grants and write like a lot of large documents. One thing she does that I think is a really good strategy is the 24-hour approach. What you do is you finish writing your essay with a bit of time, right? At least 24 hours. Print it out, and then don't pay attention to it. Don't read. Don't focus or worry about it. And then after 24 hours, go back to your essay, read the printed version, and look for spelling and grammar errors. There's a really good chance that you'll find a lot of errors and things to fix that you wouldn't have discovered if you went through that process right after working on the essay. That's oftentimes because as we're writing and working through assignments, right, we tend to skip over some of the spelling and grammar mistakes. But if we come in with a fresh pair of eyes later, it's easier for us to remember and identify potential spelling and grammar errors. Again, make sure to include those citations as well. So that's this assignment. It's worth 150 points, 15% of your grade. So it's not a big scary assignment. It's just a fun way to get us started in thinking about some of these ideas from the course. This rubric and prompt is available on Canvas for you to access and work with as you're working on this essay. Does anybody have any questions related to this assignment? Okay. Questions might come up between now and 26th. So you're welcome to email me or get in touch with me in class if those questions do come up. But just wanted to have this on your radar that it's coming up as an assignment, and just to let you know some of the major things that I've looked for. So one of the parts that I'm asking you to work on for this assignment is Belbin's self-perception inventory. I was thinking about giving you an actual quiz to fill out to figure out which of these categories you fit into. But then I quickly learned that the quiz not only is really long, but you actually have to send it to an expert that has to analyze and give you the results back, which is probably going to be pretty expensive to take long. So I thought we could talk through these, and I'll give you the chance after we talk through these, think about the roles that you most likely find yourself in or have occupied in the past. So there's 9 different roles. These aren't a be all end all, you are one of these 9, but instead to suggest that you might occupy any one of these 9, depending on the groups that you're a part of and participate. So I'd like to talk through and give you some examples of this. First of all, we have the plant. So the plant is somebody that is creative and really is focused on solving unique problems, right? I gave an example earlier in class about escape rooms as a type of small group communication, because everybody's working together to try to find a way out and figure out how to get out of the room, right? The plant is the person that is coming up with these ideas, says, oh, hey, I think the combination to the safe corresponds to the planets in the solar system. Here's a clue, right? Somebody who's able to think outside the box and come up with solutions to problems that are creative and interesting, right? You're familiar with think tanks. These are nonprofits or organizations that are designed to produce data and information, and oftentimes do so by creatively analyzing and looking at various issues. A resource investigator, right, is generally speaking a person that's focused on building bridges, right? So it's somebody that tries to create networks and opportunities for people within a group to collaborate with one another. So if you've ever been involved in something like, obviously class, but a group or organization where you've done something like icebreakers, right, where you share fun things about yourself, do activities like 2 Truths and a Lie, that sort of thing, it's an example of a resource investigator who helps to create opportunities for people to get to know each other. They're very outgoing and they're very focused on creating channels of communication within the group. That's what you might expect to see in that kind of role. A co-coordinator is somebody who finds themselves in a leadership position, right? This is somebody who generally has to take on a lot of responsibility, has to be mature, taking on that kind of leadership role. But they're also somebody that tends to delegate, right? So one thing that tends to come up a lot is if you have a group that maybe has like 8 or 9 people in it, then maybe the co-coordinator divides you into 2 or 3 different teams. If you've taken classes through Zoom and you've split off into breakout rooms, right? That was done by a co-coordinator. The co-coordinator is very much trying to direct things and is also trying to figure out who fulfills what role and what tasks they're taking on in order to get the job done. A shaper, right? You can think about a shaper as kind of like if you're sculpting, right, or putting together a piece of art. The shaper is the person that's molding the clay and putting together the ultimate product. So these are folks that generally are really interested in focusing on solving difficult problems and issues, right? They really like to pick apart things, and they like to take on difficult tasks. For instance, my dad put out a newsletter for his therapy practice. And when I was a kid, I was in charge of having to stamp and create all the envelopes for this, right? So that was a very tedious and difficult job, but I made a station and like listened to music and found a way to do that. So dealing with difficult tasks or obstacles is a tactic that a shaper can do. A monitor evaluator, right? You can think about this as kind of like the strategist or the tactician of the group. This is the person that is trying to make judgments and figure out how somebody is going to execute or deal with an issue. One example of this is if you have ever heard of or been involved in things like public relations, right? Or you've occupied or are familiar with the role like a press secretary. These are folks that are generally in charge of creating the strategy and message that somebody might put out, right? For instance, the president typically has a press secretary that's in charge of answering questions from journalists and creating a strategy of how a message might be communicated. That would be an example of this type of role. Team worker, right? So team worker is generally somebody that has their head down. A team worker is not somebody that's expressing their opinion, that's putting ideas out there all the time, but they're generally focused on working together. Team workers tend to be more conflict avoidant and focus on building consensus and agreement among people in the group, right? So if you've ever had a member of a group like an activity, it's really felt like kind of the glue of the group, or it's helped the group come together and sort out their differences, then that's the role a team worker might play. Another example of a team worker that generally works pretty well is somebody that is taking notes or putting together something like a Google Doc that helps to keep track of information. People that take notes and follow along might be in the team worker role because they're trying to create points of agreement within members of the group. An implementer, right? So one of the challenges that can come up in a small group is that if somebody is only proposing ideas and only putting ideas out there, right, the group's going to get stuck because those ideas have to go somewhere. If you're involved in a band, right, and you're trying to put out new music, you could have all the ideas in the world, but eventually you have to get out, your instruments and actually play. So an implementer is the person that puts these ideas and concepts into practice, into action. So they say, here's a great idea, let's do this. So an implementer has a pretty crucial role in translating those ideas. A completer finisher. So if you've ever done a group project or presentation, and you're the one that wants to make sure that you look it over before it gets turned in, or makes like last little revisions before you turn it in, that's completer finisher, right? You're the person that's in charge of making those last changes. Another example, right, is if you've been involved with things like a yearbook or journalism, like a school paper, right? An editor has this completer finisher role. They might be pretty actively involved in the process, but they're the ones that at the end of the day are going to cut out words, are going to reword and change and reformat the essay and ultimately get everything put together in a way that makes sense. And then we have a specialist, right? As a kind of last major category, if you've ever had the need to call maintenance, for instance, maybe your sink stopped working and you needed to call a plumber, or you have needed like an electrician, your power went out, right? You call a specialist or an expert who's able to handle or deal with an issue like a contractor. In this way, a specialist is a member of the group who might be a little bit outside of the group. They might not normally be a member, but they join and are incorporated into the group because they are tasked with solving a specific problem or issue. So generally, a specialist is somebody that comes in with a specific skill set and might be familiar with jumping into a lot of different types of groups. But they generally really focus on their specific contributions and things that they have that nobody else does. So those are these kind of 9 major categories according to this model. And again, not everybody fits into just one. And depending on the group that you're a member of, you might find that you're occupying different roles. But I want you to think about the types of roles among these 9 that you find yourself most commonly occupying when you participate in groups. So take some time on your own. You can either write or type this for your attendance credit for the day to think about and reflect on which category or multiple categories you find yourself in the most. And take some time to explain why you chose those categories to describe yourself. I'll give you a few minutes to work with it. I'll give you a couple more minutes to work on this. go ahead and finish up on the current thought or idea that you're working on. So what I'd like you to do now is to find somebody in the class that picked a different role or different roles than what you did. So you might go around, find people near you and see what roles they chose until you find somebody whose roles are a little bit different. And when you find somebody to talk to, you can also form a group of 3. I'd like you to take some time to share the differences that you see in your roles and the way that you participate in groups. And just try to understand some of the ways that you and that other person participate in groups a little bit different. Again, when you're ready, go ahead and find somebody and it's time to chat.
I said that one too. I said my first one's called Mayor. So I try not to control it. But I feel like it always puts too
Like I'm always
like really how
what I was about to
so
say
back and forth,
was
like,
I don't see
yeah,
myself as a
I just
model.
I feel like I've always that person, like my friends also like played that. Don't really care. And then it comes to plans and it's like it's like completely there. And then I also put on figure out as well. It's very simple. So that's why I feel like is implementer is just always amazing. Like I said, like first just like implement is a reliable effective person that translates my into actions like say like you want to do this, you have to do that. That's an idea. I feel like I was yeah. So that's what
so I chose teamwork because like in like a school setting mostly, like high school, there's like
yeah.
Especially when it was an actual group project. Making sure all of us on the same page. Make sure that no one's like mad at each other. I'm good. So I just feel like this is everyone. Yeah. So I guess that's the plan. I do my
Yeah.
I have a school I set up a little bit more of a monitor. So like a monitor. Becomes a great program. Evaluate strategic decision process. So like, not necessarily like decisions when it comes to the idea.
Yeah.
I definitely think like I'll just like come up with good stuff. And then you have strategic ones. Hey, this is actually told us to do.
Yeah. Like
And let them be like, oh yeah, okay, that is. We'll do this and this.
Yeah. I like people just like when I make a plan, it's like I always talk about everything. And they're like, oh, why would you be here there? I was like, yeah.
Take a minute or 2 to finish your discussion.
I like to think about that. Like I kind of be controlling it, so at the same time, like if there was a new act, I was like some stuff. And I told them like so it's like this is the idea.
All right. So I'd like to hear from a couple groups who share some of their differences and the different roles that you all found within your groups. So why don't we start? Seemed like there's a partnership over here that had some good points.
So I said I fell into 2 categories. I did coordinator and implementer. I mean, I think they're both pretty similar. That's why I think I found in both of them. Because co-coordinator is kind of like a person that like just like makes like brings everyone together, signs like you bring this, meet here at this time, want to be at this person's house, like that kind of stuff. Like I often take that role. And then implementer is also the same thing, kind of like if the group chat, the team chat is making like some sort of plans, like they're like, we should have a team dinner for this game. We'll be like, okay, like I feel like as an implementer, I'm like, okay, let's do this restaurant this time. There,
Yeah,
yeah. It's kind of I try not to be controlling, but like I feel like most chats that I'm in, just like seems like no one actually like, makes the actual plan. They say I have an idea, so
sure.
and then he was
I was some not like good opposite, but I said teamwork, especially like a school setting. I like to like work with groups and make sure that like we're on the same page, like group projects, make sure no one's behind anything, make sure no one's like arguing about answers or anything. Just, I like making sure everyone's like together and like I like being like together in a group. And outside of that study, I said I was more of like a monitor. I wasn't ever like a decision maker or anything, but I liked, somewhat helping like the ideas and stuff, making sure like making sure like it was smart and strategic and like make sure like maybe like the team, like the times lined up with other people, and then I just kind of like laid back and like people like him actually put stuff together and make it all happen.
Yeah, so some good contrasts there, right? Like a lot of times we're motivated by maybe fears or anxiety about the group and whether the group can meet a deadline or put together things that they need to. So oftentimes, right, we're put into a more implementer or managerial type of role. I think there are a lot of similarities, right, between a co-coordinator and an implementer. I think one major difference, right, would be the role of status or power, right? So an implementer doesn't necessarily have power or have a leadership role. They could be tasked with doing something. A co-coordinator could definitely be doing tasks, but they could also be delegating or dividing up tasks too. So that'd be one area where those two are slightly different, but they definitely share some similarities for sure. And how about just a group of three in the back over here?
So for myself, with all the groups I did, mostly in the school setting, is I'm more of a team worker, team player, keeping everything level, making sure everything gets done as well.
Sure.
That's usually my role in the school setting. When I go outside, I'm more of like can be a coordinator or a plant. Just depends on what group I am.
Sure.
For my role as an RA, so there's a few that kind of stuck out to me. That being plant, shaper, teamwork, and implementer, because as an RA, you gotta be pretty creative, especially when it comes into terms of kind of events and programs.
Sure.
You gotta have a lot of communication, not just with your team, but with outside resources such as staff, students, people, the public, stuff like that. And then just in general, like having to adapt to situations that are kind of like unexpected or kind of out of the blue, especially with the pandemic currently.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we have 2 RAs that are already home because everybody else is either gone or sick. So
Wow.
yeah.
It's a lot to take on.
So I'm part of a trio, so I don't know which role I'm part of, so I'm
Sure.
a student, so I'll just agree with them what's right.
Yeah. So, some interesting contrasts there, right? I appreciate it, right? Like Ryan's points here about how, you occupy maybe a leadership role if people can't show up or aren't able to show up safely, right? How many folks ended up finding themselves in multiple roles or have done multiple roles? Yeah, so a lot of you. I think a really big idea here is that even within a group, you might find yourself wearing a lot of hats and occupying a lot of roles at once, right? Oftentimes, some of the ways that groups change is based on our flexibility, is based on who's a member of the group. You might find yourself moving into different roles over time. In my other class, there's somebody who brought up that, she's not a big fan of being a leader, but oftentimes would be in a co-coordinator role because she feels the need or responsibility to show up in a leadership role because nobody else will, right? So oftentimes we do find ourselves in situations where we're taking on roles outside of our comfort zone. But this is all to say that we don't necessarily occupy just one role. We're not typecast, but we're trying to find ways to adapt and play the different roles depending on the needs of those people, as well as the strengths that we might have within a group too. So again, continue to think about some of these roles and the way that you participate and engage in a small group, since this will be stuff that will directly help you as you're preparing and thinking about this first essay. So in the remaining 10 minutes, I want to go over a couple other ideas that I think are useful and helpful to know related to group norm violation, as well as to the role of trust and the impact things like trust and status can have on small groups. So we've talked a lot about norms, right, and the unwritten rules of a group. For instance, right, if you're a member of a group, for instance, in a lot of households and families in South Korea, it's customary for the elder to eat first and for everybody to follow that person in eating food. So if that norm is violated, right, if a teenager is one of the first people to eat, that's going to be seen as a faux pas. It's going to be seen as something that goes against the traditions, the rules, the code, and behavior that members of that group are supposed to have. So it's important for us to think about the norms and to feel out, how members of a group will behave and act. If it's your first time, for instance, as an RA, right, you're probably going to have to acclimate and figure out what's okay to do and not do in the norms. So if you violate the norms, whether they're written or unwritten, right, there's some problems that can happen. One of them is that you lose influence. If you're a class clown and in a small group meeting, you're constantly cracking jokes or going off topic, right? People are less likely to take you seriously when you do have something important to say, right? Because credibility has gone down through your interruptions. Another issue that can happen, right, is ostracism, where you are isolated and no longer connect with the group. You're like on your own island. And then exclusion can happen too, right? If you refuse to follow the traditions or the norms of a group, then they might exclude you from events and participation. So it's a challenging tightrope to figure out how to engage respectfully as a member of a group. When it comes to dealing with and engaging in group norms constructively, there's a few different approaches that you can take, right? For instance, maybe you're a member of a small group, you have regular meetings, but nobody takes notes. And you say to yourself, you know what, it'd be really good if this group started taking notes so that we could track and figure out what goes on in each of our meetings. One of the first steps is to see if everybody agrees on the purpose and the goals of the group, right? If everybody is on the same page that we want to stay updated and follow and understand what happened in previous meetings, then great. That's a reason that you should start taking notes. See if other people understand the group in the same way. Is this social hour, right? Or is this a group that has specific tasks and goals that they're trying to achieve? Explaining why a norm ought to be changed. So in a critical thinking or argumentative writing class, if you've taken it before, you might be familiar with the idea of the burden of proof. That is, if you're somebody that's suggesting a change or alteration to how things are now, it's on you to explain why that change is better, why we should do it, right? Taking notes in our meetings will help us to have a clear paper trail and to review what's happened in the meeting so that we are prepared going into the next. Offer a plan and also explain how we're able to implement that plan too, right? So for instance, to take notes, maybe we can designate one person as the secretary who each meeting will be doing that and is in charge of that role. You might also think about changing the structure of the group. Again, adding a new leadership role that would be in charge of taking notes and monitoring the group's activities, right? If this is your first time joining a new group, like you're joining a new club on campus or an athletic team, right? You're not going to come into the first meeting and say, I don't like how you do things. You should do this instead. You say that, people are going to look at you weird and might not take you seriously. People are more likely to take you seriously if you are already kind of in the group as a full member and your perspective is one that really shows a clear problem in the way to address that problem. So norms are not set in stone, right? They change over time, develop, but it's on you to figure out and explain to the group in a constructive way how to address those. If you think about some of the small groups that you've joined, right, whether they're friend groups, whether they're formal organizations like clubs or activities or extracurriculars, right, you might be thinking about why. And a big reason why we oftentimes want to join groups is because of status. For instance, maybe you transferred to EOU knowing that there was a coach who maybe recruited you or a person that was part of your group. For instance, a friend or even a sibling that's involved in an activity that you wanted to be a part of. So there's a good chance that the reputation or status of people within a group makes you want to be part of that group, right? We look to the status and authority of people in a group as a sign that that's a good place to be, right? If it looks like it's a good group, and it's being run well, we're oftentimes really motivated to join. So you might be familiar, right, with something like a senior speaker or valedictorian who's in charge of giving a speech at graduation. That's a good example of status, right, of occupying that position of leadership or influence within a group. Not all groups are created equal, right? There are oftentimes differences in power and authority that come, especially if you find yourself in a leadership role or reporting to a leader like a coach. So based on the leadership of a group, right, that changes the topics that a person with higher status might talk about. For instance, a class president probably has exclusive access to the provost or the president of the university, is going to share information and details that not everybody gets access to. So status means that the topics and issues that are brought to the table are a little different. Status also means somebody's more likely to be taken seriously, right? When an authority figure speaks up because of the power they have, people are going to pay attention to them. And people with higher status might also speak more frequently or direct the conversation. Although not always, especially if they're trying to delegate out the issue or way of addressing the issue, right? It's important to know the status of the small group and members that it has in order to prevent negative communication. So for instance, if the captain or coach started speaking and you just cut them off mid-sentence, that probably wouldn't go over well, but it would be more acceptable to cut off or speak over like a fellow peer within the group. How many folks have ever done a trust fall? A few of you, right? So trust fall is when you fall backwards and you let somebody else catch you. And trust is challenging, right? We have to commit or give ourselves to the other person if we're trusting them. So trust depends on a few things, right? Integrity. What do you do when nobody's watching? Strength. Do you give it your all and really show your contribution? Do you have ability, right? Are you able to accomplish the task? Or are you dependable? Are you somebody that we can count on consistently to do something? And again, a lot of folks are not a big fan of working in groups because we have social loafers, people that are not actively contributing, and we deal with fear that they're going to bring the whole group down. So we do have to take a leap of faith in groups and a gamble where we're trusting that person to help, right? If you're playing basketball and you're passing to somebody else, putting trust in them that they will, once passed, continue to have the ball and get it in the hoop, right? Trust is also something that doesn't come right away. It's something that's earned over time. When I was a member of a small group, one kind of fun activity we did was a survival exercise where we had to get out of the woods and we had a few resources available and we had to make an argument as to why we wanted to get out. And it was a way for us to trust each other and understand how in a crisis we would get out of a difficult situation. Building trust, right, involves a few things: being direct and clear in your communication, being open to changing your mind, right? In the United States, we tend to frown upon people changing their mind or perspective. We need to be open to the idea that you might get it wrong. You might improve later. Believing in the success of a group is important. Holding yourself accountable for what you say and do, and taking responsibility, including taking a hit as a leader in a group if you're responsible for something that hasn't gone so well. So to wrap up for today, we were talking about Belbin's self-perception inventory and some of the ways that different membership roles shape the overall status and participation of a group. Things like status and trust can play a really big role in how we communicate among members of the group. So again, keep thinking about your writing assignment. Again, due 2 weeks from now. The next class, we'll discuss more issues in small group communication, including the importance of culture and context. So go ahead and email me or pass forward your attendance activities for today. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you on Friday.